In the blistering cold forest of northern Canada, all the group members were unsuccessful in hunting except for one man, Michael Terriot. Later, the party would suspect that Michael Terriot was feeding them human remains. Good evening, my fellow YouTubians. I hope you are all having a wonderful day. Now it's time to cap the day off with a bedtime story. Real quick, before we do that, let's thank our sponsor, OTG. They buy and flip ugly houses, so yeah, give them a call. Now, let's get into the Coppermine expedition. Shortly after the Napoleon Wars, Sir John Burrow conducted a peacetime mission that would turn into everything but mission: discover the Northwest Passage. This would allow the European ships a straight passage through North America via the water. This would allow European ships a cheaper, shorter travel, considering it was expensive, dangerous, and timely to trade with the markets of the Sir John Burrow would assemble a group of men serving the British Navy. Sir John Franklin was selected as the fourth-ranked person to lead such an expedition. Fortunately for an expedition this big, the expedition would begin short on supplies and even manpower. Explorers would head to Canada through way of ship and began their expedition on land and made their way to a settlement called Yorktown. Here, Franklin was expecting to receive more men and supplies, but that never happened. After failing to receive more manpower and supplies, Franklin and his men would make their way to Cumberland Lake, where they would be frozen in for over a year due to harsh weather. Once the weather cleared up, the men would travel over 500 miles north to Fort. Here, John Franklin was able to engage with the local indigenous peoples to assist him on his journey. Still short on supplies, Franklin figured they would be able to survive off the land once they got further north, but the local Aikido would warn Franklin that game would be scarce the further they got up north. Franklin, being the man he was, figured, what the hell, I got this, and decided to move forward on the journey. They would reach an establishment called Fort Enterprise. Was the main headquarters of this whole expedition. Here, the men would try to build up their supplies for the mission. However, they didn't have enough supplies for their return. The men were relying on a pledge from the Aikido tribesmen that the tribesmen would leave caches of supplies for the men's return. The men of the expedition remained skeptical of this arrangement, and often fights would break out during. To make matters even worse, along this voyage, a fight would break out between two of the explorers for falling in love with the same girl. The two men would challenge each other to a duel, but luckily for both men, someone in the group unloaded the men's weapons. One of the men involved in the dispute was sent back to Fort Chipewyan to solicit for more supplies. The rest of the men would continue their journey up north to the Coppermine. 10 days later, the expedition would come across an Inuit camp with hopes of building a trading relationship that proved fruitless after the Inuit fled their camp when they saw the party coming. 4 days later, the expedition would reach the mouth of the Coppermine River and started traveling east. However, progress was very slow due to the rough seas and weather. The team would endure this harsh punishment for 4 more days before carrying the canoes with them inland. It was now a race to beat the cold weather coming in from the north. The men decided to travel on these burying grounds, carrying their canoes. These guys are in the month of September now with all their supplies exhausted. The men were forced to survive off of foraging. The men's main source of food was an edible lichen called rockstrip, which would give majority of the men diarrhea. The voyagers at this point are very mutinous and began to discard all the canoes and the fishing rods. The voyagers causing this mayhem were forced to stay with the rest of the group because they were lost with the rest of the party in the unknown landscape. A week later, the expedition would reach Coppermine River. However, the men had to face the reality that without the canoes, the men could not cross the water. And with all the discarded fishing gear, the men could not and would not be able to catch fish. Franklin volunteers to attempt to swim across the river. Richardson ties a rope around Franklin's waist as he begins to attempt to swim across. But with all his efforts, it was impossible for him to swim across. An exhausted Franklin is pulled back ashore by his men. Right after this, across. An exhausted Franklin is pulled back ashore by his men. Right after this, man by the name of Junus, fearing for his life, ran away from the group of men in the woods and was never seen again. During Franklin's attempt to swim across the water, the men are getting chaotic and are on the verge of mutiny. They realize at this point that if they can't cross the Coppermine River, that they will all surely die. Luckily for them, a voyager in the group by the name of Pierre Saint Germain had the vision to build a makeshift raft that could be used to transport the men across the river one at a time. Eventually, after multiple reps back and forth across the river, all the men make it to the other side. This now puts the men an estimated 1 week away from Camp Fort Enterprise, the place where they began their... Still struggling roughly 2 days after the men crossed the Coppermine, two of the voyagers, Credit and Valiant, were too weak to keep up with the rest of the group and were left behind to die. The next day, Hood and Richardson, exhausted, Franklin decided to split the party into three. Back and three other voyagers, the strongest of the party, would forge ahead and then return back with supplies. Hepburn would stay back with Richardson and Hood, awaiting for the men to return. Franklin and the remaining voyagers would follow Beck's group, although within a few hours the voyagers would decide to turn back and wait for Richardson's group. Out of the three other voyagers that were with Michael Terriot's group, he was the only one to return. So he went with a group of three other people. So 4 guys with Michael Terriot. And he was the only one to come back. Linking back up with Richardson's group. On the 10th, Beck's group reached Fort Enterprise, only to find to their dismay that the expected supplies were not there. Having left a message for Franklin, they decided to forge on for Fort Providence. Franklin's group arrived on the 12th and settled down to wait. Meanwhile, at Richards, both Beck and Franklin's groups were ahead. They're closer to Fort Enterprise, or they made it to Fort Enterprise, right? And Beck's group has already started moving on to Fort Providence, going, headed towards south. So basically, in the midst of all this, Richardson is still out there in the elements with Michael Terriot and like 3 other people. So Richardson wakes up one morning. They all go on a hunt. All the guys, including Michael Terriot, they go on a hunt. Everybody comes back. Nobody is successful with the hunt except Michael Terriot. He's the one that brings back the meat. And this would continue for multiple days. Nobody in the group could understand how Michael was able to get this meat. Nobody has even seen any type of game or anything. Nobody's seen anything. So one day, Richardson's eating some of the meat, and he notices a long hair on there. And this sticks with his mind. He's like, man, that's kind of weird. Why does this piece of meat have a, long black piece of hair on it? It could be from anybody in the group, right? So he doesn't think too much of it. Then all of a sudden, one of his guys is eating as well, and he notices a toenail or a fingernail in his meat. And he's like, oh man, this is weird. I don't know, gross. Nobody really thinks too much of it. They question it, but at this point they're so hungry that they're just thankful to be alive. Richardson though is like, man, I don't know how this guy's doing it, but he's been the only one that's been successful on this entire trip as far as hunting. This guy's good at it. I'm gonna send one of my guys with him, and I just want to see how he's getting this game. So one of Richardson's guys volunteers to go with Michael. His name was like Peter. And Peter was a very religious man. He always had the Bible with him. Even up to this point. These guys are beat down, they're beat up, frozen. A lot of them probably have illnesses and sicknesses, and maybe even some of them even have frostbite at this point. So the next day, Peter would go on this hunt with Michael Terry. So Michael and Peter are walking through the woods. They can see all the trees. It's cold. They can see So Michael and Peter go on this hunt, and they walk out maybe a mile from their camp. This is Richardson's group. The groups split up, or the teams split up into groups, and two of the teams have already made it further. Way further back to camp, to areas that they're familiar with. Those guys, they're definitely in a better spot than Richardson. So Michael and Peter go on this hunt. They hit this point where they're gonna establish like their little hunting spot. So they sit down. Michael and Peter, they just begin to talk and just talk about stuff and whatnot. Well, eventually they stop talking. Peter leans up against this tree with his back turned towards Michael, and he begins to read his Bible. Michael sees Peter doing this. He sees that Peter's back is exposed to him, so Michael sneaks up behind him with his rifle and shoots him in the back of the head, killing him instantly, blowing the front of Peter's face off, making Peter completely unrecognizable. He goes from sitting position all the way to lean forward over his Bible with his butt in the air. Brains everywhere, all in the snow. Blood all over the Bible. The men hear this, and they begin their journey towards where they believe they heard the shot. Now, this is about a mile out. It's probably less because I know sound has a hard time traveling through the trees. So this is probably even closer. So the men eventually find Michael, and they find Peter. They find Peter leaning over his Bible. He's dead. Michael's like, hey, I think he killed himself. I just came back. We split up for a little bit. I went to go see if I could spook any animals up and bring them towards Peter. The guys, they don't believe this immediately. They're like, there's no way. But eventually they end up forgiving Michael, and Michael comes back to the camp. Now Richardson's full on. Later that day, the men are bedded down in like a circular formation. Richardson can hear something moving, so he just briefly peeks his head out to make sure that it is one of the guys, and he can see Michael leaving the sleeping area where they're all staged at sleeping. Michael begins to walk in the woods away from the camp. Now Richardson can see this because he can see the firelight. The fire is giving him light to be able to see all this stuff. Richardson's still very curious about what happened to Peter. He doesn't believe that Peter killed himself. So Richardson would begin to follow Michael into the forest. Michael doesn't know he's being followed, and Richardson's doing his best to keep quiet, stepping in Michael's footsteps. Now Michael would travel out maybe roughly about a mile, about the same distance that him and Peter went out. Richardson, still being sneaky, creeps up, and he has moonlight enough to where he can see what's in front of him and all this stuff and make out brief details within, maybe 20, 30 feet. As Richardson gets closer, he notices that Michael stops, and he's now lifting up this little roof to this hole in the ground. He lifts it up, and he sees Michael jump into it. And he can just see the top of Michael's shoulders as he's looking down at whatever is in the hole. So Richardson's laying down now. He's being real quiet. He's just watching, and he can see Michael. Then Michael starts making cuts at something, and he's making noises. Richardson doesn't quite know what it is. And he sees Michael, he's just taking pieces of what looks like to be meat out of the hole and setting it on the ground. It's like he's cutting these pieces of meat off. Richardson lay there. He's just watching all this unfold. Then finally he says, you know what? I'm going to get this guy. I'm going to get this guy for getting Peter. So Richardson goes, hey! Michael looks up and he can see him spooked. He freezes. Richardson pulls his gun out and shoots Michael right in the face, killing him almost instantly, blowing Michael out of the hole almost. All you can see now is just half his body just hanging in the hole, and Michael's just laying there dead. Richardson walks up to the hole to see where he's been getting this meat from. This is the big secret that they've all been waiting for. They've all been waiting to know. Want to know, how has Michael been so successful in all this time? Richardson walks up and he's like, he starts crying, and he realizes as he's looking down in the hole that they were eating the expedition, the voyagers, the expeditioners that left with Michael when Franklin split them all up into groups. Basically, it looked like Michael had shot them all in the head. And now he was giving them flesh, feeding the other expeditioners flesh from the other party members that Michael had killed. So Richardson would head back to camp. All the guys would load their things, and they would begin their week's journey, just struggling to make it. Richardson would share the news with the guys. The guys can't believe it. They want to keep it quiet, but they know when they get back, it's going to be talked about. So eventually, the guys are all about to die. They're on the verge of starvation now, and then they were eventually saved by the Inuit people. They would basically guide them back to Fort Enterprise, and then from there, the guys would basically jump on ship and head back home. It's said that Franklin would go on this trip 2 to 3 more times. His third, fourth, to maybe even fifth time, he would end up disappearing forever. And the last people to see him was the people of the Inuit tribe. And they also had relics from him and all this stuff. Well, that's all I have, everybody. I hope y'all have a great day, and I'm going to keep trying to drop these stories out. So y'all stay tuned. If y'all don't mind, please hit that like and subscribe button. Show your boy a little bit of love, and stay tuned for the next one. And remember, hey, you matter and you're loved. All right, everybody, I'm out.